The sheriff burst into the yard, shouting, "Cole Turner, the most wanted man in Texas!" as deputies dragged him from the barn in chains. Grace stood on the porch, her son bleeding beside her, watching the only man who had brought peace back into their lives hauled away like a criminal. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The next morning, the wind blew colder, though summer still reigned. Grace rose before the rooster crowed, her bones aching in a way grief never stopped teaching her. The kettle hissed, and she stood by the stove in her nightdress, staring at the glowing embers where Cole Turner's wanted poster had turned to ash. She didn't doubt the sheriff would return, louder and crueler. But for now, the silence was hers. By dawn, Cole was already in the field. He worked with the silent precision of a man who had something to prove but no one to prove it to. Grace watched him through the warped glass of the kitchen window, how he moved with quiet certainty, hammering planks into place on the barn door without glancing back once. His shoulders rose and fell in rhythm, not just with labor, but with memory. There was sorrow in the way he moved, something unspoken that Grace recognized without needing to ask. Jesse hovered nearby, pretending to be indifferent as he swept the porch, but every few seconds his eyes darted toward Cole, drinking in his movements like a boy memorizing scripture. Grace had seen it before, how a child looks for a father in the outline of another man. It made her chest tighten. Jesse didn't talk about his father anymore. Not since the nightmares stopped and the weight of manhood began to press against his growing shoulders. But Grace knew. That ache, that emptiness, it never fully left. It just found other corners to settle into. By mid-morning, a dust cloud curled down the road, a neighbor's buggy passing slow. The woman inside didn't wave. She just stared. Grace felt the heat of shame crawl up her neck, but she didn't flinch. She stepped off the porch, bucket in hand, and headed for the well. Every step was deliberate, every gesture a quiet defiance. "You don't owe them anything." Cole's voice came behind her later, unexpected. She turned. He stood by the fence he'd just mended, sweat glinting on his brow, his eyes unreadable. "Not them. Not the sheriff. Not the world." Grace held his gaze. "You talk more than you let on." His lips quirked into something like a smile. "Only when the words matter." That night, the moon rose full and clear over the barn. Grace sat with her sewing under the porch lamp while Jesse slept, and Cole sat on the steps sharpening a blade that had seen too much life. They didn't speak, but the stillness between them wasn't silence. It was understanding. The kind only the broken share, the kind that means something's shifting, even if the world won't like it. Sunday came like a judgment, hard and hot. The bell at the white-clapboard church tolled across the plain, summoning the righteous and the hypocrites alike. Grace buttoned her best calico dress, faded but clean, and braided her silver-streaked hair into a low knot. Jesse walked beside her, eyes down, fiddle-calloused fingers twitching at his sides. When they stepped through the doors, the hymn book clutched in her hands felt heavier than iron. Pews creaked as the congregation shifted. A few nodded stiffly. Most did not. The pastor hesitated a moment too long before continuing the sermon. No one offered a seat. Grace stood tall at the back, Jesse beside her. Her hands didn't tremble. Her spine didn't bend. But inside, the weight of every glance pressed down like a yoke. After service, no one spoke directly to her, but the air buzzed with unfinished sentences. Shame, really. A woman her age. Not safe, not for the boy. No telling what a man like that might do. One woman, Sarah Beecham, mother of 5 and self-appointed guardian of moral decency, passed close enough to hiss, "We all make mistakes, Grace, but not all of us invite them to breakfast." Grace didn't answer. Not then. She took Jesse's hand and walked back toward the farm, their steps slow, but unbroken. The next morning, she rose early to milk the cow, her knuckles raw from churning. The barn was cooler than the house, and smelled of hay and something clean. Outside, Cole was already at work, chopping wood in the pink light of dawn. His shirt clung to his back, the rhythm of the axe like a heartbeat. "I reckon I've done more to rebuild this place than tear it down," he said when he saw her watching. "You've done more than most who wear crosses around their necks and knives in their smiles," she answered, her voice steady. That evening, Jesse nailed a horseshoe to the side of the barn. "For luck," he muttered. Cole smiled, said nothing. Grace brought supper out on tin plates, cornbread, beans, and blackberry preserves from last summer's jars. They ate on the porch as the wind shifted west, softer now. No one spoke of the church. No one needed to. The world beyond their fence still sneered, but inside those acres, something stronger was rooting itself. One swing of the axe, one bite of warm bread, one fiddle tune at a time. And in that quiet defiance, hope bloomed. Not loud, not fast, but real. The cell stank of old sweat and rusted metal. Cole Turner sat on the wooden bench, hands cuffed in front of him like a dog caught in someone else's trap. The jailhouse was quiet, save for the tick of a crooked clock and the low murmur of a deputy 2 rooms over, playing cards with no one. Time didn't move here. It slouched. But Cole? He sat straight, eyes open, waiting. Across town, Grace moved like a woman pulled forward by something larger than anger. She washed Jesse's bruised face in silence, brushing a thumb across the swollen skin with a touch that lingered longer than it needed to. She didn't cry. She hadn't since the day the army sent her husband home in a flag-covered box. Tears were a luxury for women with soft lives. Old Bert Langley returned that evening with shaking hands and a folder thick with dust and guilt. "I should have come sooner," he mumbled. Grace didn't answer. She was already lighting the second lamp and spreading paper across the kitchen table like a general mapping a war. They wrote letters by lamplight, to the judge, to the mayor, to the federal office in Austin. Jesse, still sore but burning with a righteous heat, ran half of them to town himself, mud on his boots and steel in his spine. Witnesses long gone were tracked through cousins, land records, old telegrams. Grace pressed on, face drawn, voice even. Word traveled faster than wheels. At the general store, whispers changed tone. The banker who once eyed her land like a buzzard offered to defer her loan. She refused with a smile so cold it iced the air. A week passed, then another. At Cole's hearing, the room was packed. Half the town came, not out of justice but curiosity, like rubberneckers at a train wreck. The prosecutor stuttered. The sheriff avoided Grace's gaze, and then Bert Langley stood and told the truth that had rotted his bones for half a decade, that it had been his brother, dead now in a saloon brawl, who'd robbed the train. That Cole had drawn his gun not to steal, but to stop it. That Cole had vanished not out of guilt, but shame. Shame for surviving a system built to crush the wrong man. The judge, a man who rarely blinked, sat back in silence for a long moment. Then, "All charges dismissed. Mr. Turner, you're free to go." No cheers erupted. No one clapped. But Grace, standing in the back in a simple gray dress, nodded once. And in that nod was every mile she'd walked to reclaim what the world had tried to take. Not just her farm, not just her name, but her right to decide who was good and who was worth saving. That evening, the sun bled gold across the fields as Cole walked back through the gate. No words were spoken. But for the first time, Grace let the door stay open behind her. The wind that swept across the fields no longer carried dust and doubt. It carried the scent of honeysuckle and memory. Where once the earth cracked under drought and hardship, now wildflowers bloomed in careful rows, sunbursts of yellow, purple, and soft white, planted by a boy who was growing into a man with calloused hands and a tender heart. Jesse knelt beside those blossoms each morning, pulling weeds like it was penance, or maybe prayer. Inside the house, Grace moved differently, not faster, not lighter, but with the certainty of someone who no longer lived on borrowed time. She polished the windows until they caught the morning sun just right. She stitched a new set of curtains with lace from her mother's trunk and placed a jar of peach preserves on the sill, because beauty deserved to be looked at, even if it was simple. Cole, too, had changed, but not in the way people expected. He didn't take over the farm or sleep in Grace's house. He stayed in the lean-to he built with his own hands beside the barn, rose before daylight, and let his actions speak in the way only a man once broken can. He never called himself innocent. He never claimed he was owed anything. But every fence he mended, every tool he sharpened, every wordless look he shared across the fields told the same truth. He was here now, and he wasn't leaving. The town, slow and stubborn as the river in August, began to soften. Mrs. Appleby, who once crossed the street to avoid Grace, came by with a pie and lingered long enough to ask about Jesse's schoolwork. The pastor, after 3 Sundays of uneasy glances, finally invited Cole to supper. "No sermons, I promise," he said. "Just roast and good company." Respect didn't bloom like the flowers. It crept in root by root, but it stayed. At the harvest festival, beneath an oak tree older than memory, Cole found her. He didn't bow, didn't ask permission, just held out his hand, palm up, as if offering nothing and everything. "Would you dance with me, Miss Wilkins?" Grace looked at that hand. Strong, weathered, honest. She didn't hesitate. The fiddle started slow, the notes round and full. They moved in a small circle, feet pressing into the same earth they had bled and planted into. Around them, lanterns glowed. The townsfolk watched, some with quiet surprise, others with softened hearts. There were no declarations, no kiss. Just Grace, leaning in slightly, and Cole holding her like something sacred. Not because she was fragile, but because she was whole. It wasn't a love story born of rescue. It was one born of recognition. And in that moment, beneath the oak, with Jesse watching nearby and the stars breaking open above them, Grace Wilkins was not a widow, and Cole Turner was not a wanted man. They were simply 2 people who had survived, who had chosen, quietly and without regret, to keep living. Together.